The authorities thought it was just another missing person case, until they found the buried microphone. What they heard on the tape didn't just point to a killer. It revealed the sound of a woman dying, in real time. And someone had been listening the whole time. She was the kind of woman people noticed, not for her beauty though she was striking, but for her confidence. Her voice especially made people stop and listen. As a radio journalist, her words carried weight. She wasn't just reporting the news, she was digging into it, peeling back layers of small-town silence, exposing the things people weren't supposed to talk about. In a community where everyone knew each other's secrets but no one dared speak them aloud, she was the exception. And maybe that's why when she disappeared, no one was truly surprised. But they were terrified. It happened on a Wednesday. Midweek, midday, bright sun overhead. Nothing unusual. She had wrapped up her morning show and left the station around 12:30. Her car was found that evening parked outside a closed hardware store, locked with the keys inside, her bag still on the passenger seat. No sign of a struggle, no witnesses. Just gone. At first, people thought maybe she had gone off the grid. She had done it before, brief, unannounced getaways when she needed to clear her mind or prepare for a major story. But this time felt different. Her phone was off. Her emails went unanswered. Days passed. No activity on her bank accounts. Her apartment was untouched, her fridge full, mail stacked on the counter. The police did what they always do. They opened a missing person case, talked to friends, checked security cameras. Nothing pointed to foul play. No signs of forced entry at her home. No footprints near her abandoned car. But people who knew her well, the producer she worked with, her younger brother, even her ex-boyfriend, insisted that something was wrong. She had been working on a story, they said. A big one. Something about misuse of federal funds tied to a land development deal. She had mentioned names, hinted at threats, but never seemed afraid. If anything, she was energized. Determined. A week after she vanished, a small package arrived at the radio station. No return address. Inside was a plain flash drive, unmarked except for a post-it note stuck to its side, "Play me." The station manager assumed it was a listener submission, possibly a prank. But when he plugged it into his laptop and hit play, everything changed. The file was audio. Scratchy at first, filled with static and muffled background noise. Then a voice, hers. Frantic. Gasping. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" A loud thud. Then more breathing. Shallow. Panicked. Dirt moving. A scraping sound. I don't know where I am. Please. Please, if you can hear this, I'm underground. I think I've been buried." Silence followed, then a man's voice. Distant. Cold. As if he were speaking through a radio from far away. "You're not alone. I'm here. I'm always here." The station manager froze. He played it again. Then a third time. His hands shook as he picked up the phone to call the police. The file was sent to forensic analysts immediately. VoicePrint analysis confirmed what everyone feared. It was real. It was her. And the timestamp embedded in the file metadata showed it was recorded just 4 days prior. Which meant, at least at that time, she had still been alive. A massive search began. Authorities brought in cadaver dogs, thermal imaging drones, geologists to examine the soil. Every second counted, but the landscape was too vast. The countryside was littered with hundreds of abandoned wells, root cellars, storm drains, any of which could be a makeshift tomb. Meanwhile, the media picked up the story. Buried alive. Radio host sends message from the grave. The underground voice. The audio was played nationwide. Her cries became a haunting soundtrack to the investigation. Listeners everywhere held their breath, hoping for another message, another clue. But nothing came. Investigators reviewed all her notes, her files, her emails. She had indeed been investigating a land deal involving illegal kickbacks and zoning violations. A few names stood out: local developers with histories of violence, a councilman with ties to private security firms, even a retired police chief. But no smoking gun. No one with a clear motive or evidence linking them to her disappearance. Still, something felt targeted. Calculated. This wasn't a random crime. Whoever did this knew her routine, understood how to move her car, knew how to erase digital traces and leave behind only a single haunting breadcrumb. And then, after all that, complete silence. But it didn't stay silent for long. 5 days after the flash drive, another recording arrived. This time, delivered in person by a man in a motorcycle helmet. He dropped the envelope on the front desk of the sheriff's office and rode off before anyone could stop him. Inside was another drive. It was worse than the first. She was weaker. Her breathing slower. She cried. Whispered names, her brother, her mother. Then she began to pray. A single sound interrupted her, static. Then that same voice again. Closer this time. More intimate. Keep talking. I want to remember the sound of your voice. Then a click. The file ended. No demands. No threats. Just pure psychological torment. And that's when investigators realized this wasn't about ransom, revenge, or even silence. It was about control. Someone wanted to listen. Someone wanted her suffering preserved. Heard. Witnessed. This was a performance and they were the audience. As search efforts doubled, public outrage grew. Volunteers formed civilian search teams. Audio engineers tried to isolate background noise to determine the type of soil, humidity levels, even insect patterns. Every possible tool was used, but it felt like chasing shadows. One morning, a retired sound technician working with the FBI noticed something in the second recording. A faint echo like metal on concrete, bouncing back in tight intervals. He compared it with old mine blueprints from the region. A match was found. The location was isolated, an old ventilation shaft from a defunct quarry. It was buried under decades of debris. Excavators were brought in. They dug for 8 hours. When they finally reached the coffin, it was too late. She was there, still serene. A small microphone placed inches from her mouth. The recorder was intact. Batteries dead. But the data was recoverable. The last thing she said was a whisper, "I know you're still listening." And he was. The audio file wasn't just disturbing, it was forensic gold. But it was also a psychological horror no one had anticipated. Investigators played it repeatedly in a soundproof lab, isolating every faint detail, breaths, vibrations, subtle shifts in tone. The woman's voice was unmistakable, raw with panic, weakening with time. Her surroundings were eerily quiet aside from the occasional rumble, the sound of shifting earth, and the scratching of her nails on something hard. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what they were hearing. The unraveling of a mind trapped in a coffin beneath the soil, knowing that help might never come. The microphone had been deliberately installed inside the box she was buried in. It wasn't a simple recording device. This was high-end, the kind used in surveillance operations. It had been wired to transmit in real time, routed through an encrypted signal. Somewhere, someone had been listening as she screamed, begged, whispered, cried, and finally fell silent. For the team of analysts and field agents assigned to the case, this was more than evidence. It was a ticking clock they had already failed to beat. What remained was to piece together how it had all happened. How had she been recorded in real time without anyone knowing? How had the device stayed active for days? Who had the technical knowledge, the resources, the emotional detachment, to not just commit the act but listen to it unfold? The data from the microphone led to clues. Sound experts isolated background frequencies, tiny, seemingly meaningless details like the way her voice bounced, the pitch of her breathing, even the muffled echo of something metallic. It hinted that she was underground, yes, but also near something industrial, perhaps a pipe or reinforced concrete. Combined with the acoustic delay, this narrowed the possible burial sites to man-made underground structures, not open fields. Meanwhile, the forensics team pulled what they could from the hardware. The transmitter was rare, military surplus, custom-modified. Serial numbers had been filed off. Battery life was extended using an external power source. Whoever built it had done this before. Or at least they had planned to do this long in advance. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was theater, carefully choreographed, meticulously timed. But the true horror wasn't in the technology, it was in the human moments captured on the recording. Her voice changed over the hours. At first she was in shock, angry, disoriented, certain that someone would come. She shouted her name, her location as best she could recall, tried to describe what she had last seen before losing consciousness. There were long silences, then pounding as she kicked or hit the coffin lid, then more pleas. She tried reasoning with whoever was listening. At one point she addressed the microphone directly. "I know you're there. I know you can hear me. Just, please don't let me die down here. You don't have to do this. You can still stop this." Her voice trembled. She coughed. The air, investigators realized, must have been thinning by then. She gasped between sentences. Said she was cold. Then came the moment that turned everyone in the room cold. A response. A man's voice, calm, nearly a whisper, almost loving. "You sound beautiful when you're afraid." It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. No anger. No madness. Just pure fascination. The way a scientist might speak to an experiment. The woman recoiled audibly in the recording. There was no scream, just silence. Followed by sobbing. What disturbed the investigators most was what came next. She began talking to herself. Not in panic but in resignation. She tried to remember songs she loved. She repeated memories, her childhood dog's name, her favorite movie, the name of her college roommate. It was like she was trying to hold on to who she was while her world collapsed around her. Hours later, she sang softly to herself. Her voice cracked often, and it was clear her strength was fading. But she was trying to leave something behind, some echo of herself. Then she began addressing the person again. If you're still listening, I hope this gives you what you need. I hope this makes you feel powerful. Because when they find you, and they will, you'll lose everything. And all you'll have left is this voice. Even as her body was weakening, her mind hadn't fully broken. She was defiant even then. But the man never answered again. After that point in the recording, the audio devolved into the long sound of stillness, punctuated only by breathing, and then, nothing. For 2 hours the device recorded silence. But it was still transmitting. And that meant the person who had installed it was still on the other end. Listening. The psychological profile took shape quickly. This wasn't about silencing a journalist. This wasn't about revenge. It was obsession. Not with her but with the act. The killer didn't want her dead as much as he wanted to observe her dying. The microphone wasn't a tool, it was the ritual. Every part of the act was engineered to prolong the moment, to savor it. The investigation pivoted. The team began reviewing cases of audio surveillance specialists, ham radio operators, underground bunker hobbyists, anyone with a deep understanding of sound transmission and an unhealthy interest in power dynamics. A few names surfaced, but one stood out. A former acoustics engineer who had worked briefly on surveillance systems for a private security contractor. He had no criminal record. No family. Lived alone in a remote property on the outskirts of town. Years ago, he'd applied to work at the same radio station where the victim had built her career. He was rejected. When agents approached his home, he was calm. Invited them in. Offered coffee. Acted like he had nothing to hide. Until they searched the basement. There, behind a false wall, they found it. A fully soundproofed room, covered in acoustic foam with shelves of recording devices. In the center of the room was a chair facing a table. On it, a single speaker. It was hooked up to a receiver. One of the agents reached down and pressed the button to play the last transmission. It was her voice again. Soft, weak, fading. I know you're still listening. The man didn't flinch. Later, during interrogation, when asked why he did it, he gave a single answer. I didn't want to kill her. I just wanted to hear her leave. And he had. Every breath. Every word. Until the very end. He had no history of violence. No history of theft, assault, not even a speeding ticket. On paper, he was the kind of man no one would notice. Quiet, polite, distant but not impolite. He was the kind of person who faded into the background of a town that didn't have much movement. He worked remote freelance jobs in audio engineering, mostly restoring damaged recordings for podcasts and old cassette digitization services. He had once worked in surveillance tech, briefly, but left after a short stint, citing philosophical differences with management. Nothing about him screamed danger. And yet, he had orchestrated one of the most chilling crimes in recent memory. Not with a gun. Not with a knife. But with silence, wire, and time. When they raided his house, the signs were subtle but unmistakable. The walls were lined with acoustic dampening foam, not for music or podcasts, but for isolation. No echoes, no feedback. He had constructed his own private chamber, free from the outside world. In the center of the room was a table with a series of headphones, all attached to vintage tape decks, reel-to-reel machines, digital recorders. It wasn't the quantity of equipment that unnerved the investigators, it was the precision. Each piece was labeled, organized, maintained, like museum artifacts. And at the center of it all was one reel, still loaded. It was her. The audio was clean. Too clean. Hours of it. He had recorded everything, the entire span of her final days underground. Not just to preserve it. He had curated it. Spliced out sections where she coughed, repeated herself, sobbed too loudly. It was as if he was editing her death for tone and clarity. Investigators found multiple versions of the audio, one raw, uncut, others trimmed down into highlight reels. There were even notes scribbled in a ledger, timestamps of emotional peaks, first scream, negotiation attempt, resignation, final breath. Each event in her suffering cataloged, itemized, treated as a component of a performance. And still, there were no signs of a struggle in his home. No trophies. No personal items of the victim. He didn't fantasize about her in the traditional sense. He didn't keep her pictures or mementos. His obsession wasn't with her. It was with the process of her unraveling. The sound of her mind breaking in real time. The vulnerability in her voice as the air thinned, her fear intensified, her hope flickered and eventually died. During the interrogations he was eerily cooperative. He didn't ask for a lawyer. Didn't protest. He simply sat, listened to the questions, and answered in the same quiet, composed voice that had likely unnerved her in her final hours. At one point, when asked what the purpose was, he looked up and said, "She had the most compelling voice I'd ever heard. It was honest, pure. I wanted to hear how far that voice would go before it disappeared." The psychiatrist assigned to evaluate him labeled it, "pure auditory compulsion layered over a control-based psychopathy." He didn't want sex. He didn't want dominance in a physical sense. He wanted proximity to suffering without being seen. He was addicted to the vulnerability in voices, not the words but the inflections, the tremors, the way a person tries to sound brave when they're terrified. He called it, the music beneath the panic. The recordings he kept weren't all of her. That discovery came later. When investigators analyzed his drives, they found years of secret recordings. Random strangers. Phone calls intercepted. Baby monitors. People breathing in hospital rooms. It was as though he had been building toward this moment for years. Testing soundscapes, monitoring emotional patterns, building a library of human fragility. But she was different. She was the first he interacted with. The first he chose not just to record but to speak to. For him, this was an evolution. And in his mind it wasn't murder, it was art. In his trial, when presented with the charges, he never denied them. In fact, he corrected the prosecutor when they misstated a timeline from the recordings. He took pride in the process. When asked if he felt remorse, he tilted his head and said, "I didn't end her. Time did. I was just there to witness it." The courtroom was silent. Her family was there. They couldn't bear to hear the tapes, but they listened to his words. Cold. Disconnected. Not the voice of a monster, but something much worse. A man so lost in the structure of his obsession that he had rationalized every moment. He never raised his voice. Never shed a tear. When shown a photograph of her, he studied it carefully and said, "She had presence. Even in the dark. You could feel it." His obsession was not with control in a physical sense, but auditory ownership. He wanted to be the only one to hear her die. To have the last experience of her voice all to himself. In his mind he hadn't killed her. He had captured her. Preserved her final story. But his version had no justice, no rescue, no redemption. Just a descent into silence. He was convicted on multiple counts: kidnapping, murder, unlawful surveillance, and obstruction of justice. The judge labeled him a predator unlike any they'd seen. Not because of rage or violence, but because of the cold, calculated void behind his eyes. He wasn't insane. He was, if anything, too sane, dispassionate, clinical. Like he'd studied humanity and decided to remove himself from its burden, observing pain as others might observe rainfall. But the echoes of what he did didn't end in the courtroom. Her voice, preserved in those tapes, became a symbol. Not just of fear but of how deeply evil can hide behind calmness. In the weeks that followed, excerpts of her final words were played not on sensationalist news, but in safety briefings for journalists, training modules for investigators, and memorials for victims of unsolved disappearances. Some wanted the recordings destroyed. Others argued they should be kept as evidence, a warning. In the end, the tapes were sealed under court order, stored deep in the evidence vault, never to be played again. But there's one detail that was never officially released, something only the lead detective revealed years later in an interview, long after the case had been closed. In the final seconds of the last recording, after a long stretch of silence, after it seemed she had passed, there was a faint sound. A single breath. Followed by a whisper. "I hope you hear this when you die." Click. End of recording. Even in the dark, even beneath the soil, even as her lungs gave out, she left behind one final truth. She knew him. And she made sure until the end that he knew she did too.